Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Sitting here enjoying an absolutely great cup of coffee. Man, I love my coffee. I got to tell you, I really love my coffee. This is Kona, one of my very favorite blends. By the way, for those of you who have sent me some samples of the different blends of coffee, I really do appreciate that. It's greatly appreciated. Okay, we are looking at Matthew chapter 24 and verse 34. Remember, Jesus had been asked in response to his prediction of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. When shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, make no mistake, folks, and scholarship is virtually agreed on this. The apostles, in their mind, linked the fall of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple, Christ's coming, the end of the age. Now, of course, the monkey wrench in that, as far as the futurist views are concerned, is that we are told, Craig Blomberg does this, Kenneth Gentry does this. You know, one commentator after another, Beale does it. They tell us, well, there's no doubt that the apostles, in their mind, connected the fall of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple, with the end of the age and Christ's coming. But, of course, they were confused. They were wrong. I mentioned to you that I'm finishing up right now, hopefully very soon, a book entitled, Were the Apostles Confused? It is absolutely amazing how fundamental that claim is. Listen to me. If it were not for the claim and the view that the apostles were confused, ignorant, wrong, to link the fall of Jerusalem and the temple with the end of the age, if that presuppositional view were not imposed on Matthew 24, in other words, to put it another way, if the apostles were right, if they were not dumb, if they were not ignorant, if they were not confused, then futurism is dead, because that means, well, it means the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, the end of the age, did in fact occur at the time of the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem. You see? That forces us to look at this term, this generation. Now, yesterday I shared with you 2 or 3 different views of the definition of what Jesus meant when he said, this generation shall by no means pass away. Now, before I share with you what I'm about to share with you, we have to keep in mind Jesus was speaking to living, breathing apostles. When they asked for signs of his coming in the end of the age, he said, you will see. Over and over again, he told those living, breathing human beings, you will see. Now, on any normal, legitimate, grammatical reading of that text, that would demand that those apostles would see what he's talking about. I mean, after all, when he said, you will see, weren't they going to see? Now, attempts are made to say, well, okay, but Jesus was speaking collectively. He was saying, you Jews. In other words, not you apostles, but the Jews will see these things. Not what it says, is it? And it will not do to go to other passages, such as Deuteronomy, in which the Lord very often said, and you will do this, and you will do that, and you will do this, when we are told emphatically and specifically in text after text that he was in fact speaking of far off. In other words, he was speaking representatively. But guess what? He's not doing that in Matthew 24. He never says, ever says, these things will not happen soon. They will happen far off. No. He simply says, you will see. Now, again, I shared with you yesterday 2 or 3 of the different views. So I'm going to take the time today to share with you a good list. It's about as good a list as I have found. This is found in Dale Allison Jr. and W.D. Davies' commentary on Matthew. And they give us a good summary collection of the different views that have been offered to define this generation. Number 1, all these things refers to the destruction of Jerusalem. Now remember, they are speaking of all of these things in the context of this generation shall not pass. All right? Number 2, all these things refers to the eschatological scenario as outlined in verses 4 to 31 and declares that it shall come to pass before Jesus' generation has gone. In favor of this is the imminent expectation of many early Christians, compare Matthew 10:23, Mark 9:1, as well as John 21:20 to 23, which reflects the belief that Jesus would come before all the disciples had died. And so most modern commentators hold to that. Number 3, patristic opinion could identify Gamaliel with the church against which the gates of Hades will not prevail. It will endure until the end. That was the view of Chrysostom and Eusebius. Number 4, occasionally Gamaliel is equated with the Jewish people or the human race. Jerome took that position. While the latter equation creates banality, the first perhaps fits the broader context. Jesus promised that the tribulation of Judea, however terrible, will not obliterate the chosen people. Compare Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. But given that our verse immediately trails the parable of the fig tree, which is what I shared with you yesterday, surely the chronological sense of Gamaliel is more natural. Number 5, this generation might be the generation that, quote, sees all these things. From Matthew's perspective, therefore, perhaps some future generation. That's what I shared with you as one of the dispensational explanations. Number 6, according to Gundry, in his commentary on Matthew, page 491, this generation may mean this kind of people. The sense is qualitative and not chronological. And Gundry says the emphasis would then fall on the perversity of the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, and the chronological extent of the generation would remain open, unquote. Number 7, Calvin seems to hold that all these things are the evils of the discourse, all of which fell upon, quote, that generation of the church, although they continue to plague the church thereafter. Number 8, Meyer, in his commentary on Matthew, page 289, raises the possibility of interpreting, quote, the verse in light of Matthew's presentation of Jesus' death and resurrection as a proleptic parousia, unquote. And then Davies and Allison say this: we favor interpretation number 2, which is all these things, refers to the eschatological scenario in verses 4 to 31. Gamaliel plainly refers to Jesus' generation, his contemporaries, in Matthew 11:16, Matthew 12:39, verse 41, verse 45, 16:4, 17:17, as well as in the close parallel of Matthew 23:36. And the placement of our verse after a prophecy of the parousia is suggestive. It is to be objected that this makes a false prophecy and raises the issue of 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 to 5. We can only reply that some of Jesus' contemporaries were perhaps still alive when Matthew wrote. So he did not have the problem that we do. In summary, then, the last judgment will fall upon this generation just as earlier judgments fell upon the generation of the flood and the generation of the wilderness. Let me reiterate here, folks. The only reason that about 7 out of 8 of these suggestions were ever created, were ever invented, was because the authors of those suggestions believed in a literal, earth-burning, time-ending event. They refused to see and to recognize that the language of the coming of the Lord of Matthew 24 through 31 was typical apocalyptic language, as Colin Brown, in his Theology of the New Testament, pointed out. The key to understanding verse 34 is to understand that the language of Matthew 24, 29 to 31 is taken directly out of the Old Testament, in which God acted within history, not to end history, in bringing judgment on one nation after another, and those judgments were called the day of the Lord. The language was never fulfilled literally, visibly, bodily, and physically. And thus Jesus was predicting that he was going to come in the glory of the Father as the Father had come, and that means he was not predicting that he was going to come literally, visibly, bodily, and physically. Wasn't coming as a 5'5" Jewish man. He was going to come in the glory of the Father, and he was going to do it, and he did do it in the first century, in his generation. We have more to say on this next week. And in the meantime, don't forget, tomorrow, Friday, we will continue our refutation of Lance Conley's book, Hope Resurrected. Now, very quickly, Mr. Conley copied and pasted a ton of material from a great number of patristic writers, commentators, ostensibly to answer what I've been presenting from the text of Isaiah 65 and 66 in response to his claim that after the day of the Lord, there is no evangelism, there's no sickness, there's no sin, there's no death, life does not go on as normal. But you know what? Mr. Conley's own copied and pasted, rather lengthy post, his own sources teach there would be sin, there would be death, there would be labor, there would be evangelism in the new creation. You don't want to miss tomorrow's program, in which I'm going to drive that home even further, thus totally, absolutely, 100% refuting Lance Conley's entire book. Because you see, Isaiah 66 predicts unequivocally, a prediction of evangelism after the day of the Lord. I'll see you on the flip side.